Hello. Hi, everybody. While everyone's getting their tea and their cookies and finding their seats, I'll do a little brief introduction. My name is Lexi, and I'm a naturalist with the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies. And each winter, ACES partners with Wilderness Workshop and Roaring Fork Audubon to co-host these Naturalist Nights, a free speaker series featuring experts who explore different topics relating to the natural world. What do we have here? So, just so you guys know, tonight's talk will be recorded on that camera back there. So if you ever want to go back and rewatch this recording for any reason, or if maybe you had a friend that wanted to come to this event that wasn't able to make it, they can re-reference these videos on both ACE's YouTube channel and the Wilderness Workshop YouTube channel. We would also like to thank our gold level sponsors that make these Naturalist Nights happen. So those gold level sponsors are Garfield and Hecht, Reese Henry, and Ken Ransford. So without further ado, all right. I also want to plug the next Naturalist or ACES event, which is the Wildland Recreation and Ecological Disturbance Talk. And that'll be on February 19th in Carbondale and February 20th right here in Aspen. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's speakers, which are Celene Hawkins and Izabella Ruffino. Celene is the Nature Conservancy's Colorado River Tribal Partnerships Program Director. She leads the Conservancy's efforts to ethically and effectively partner with tribal nations and indigenous peoples on freshwater conservation projects in the Colorado River Basin. Izabella also works for the Nature Conservancy as Colorado's Tribal and Indigenous Engagement Program Manager, where she serves as a liaison with tribal nations, indigenous communities, and organizations. Izabella is from the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe in Michigan and helps to guide TNC Colorado's efforts to build cultural awareness for meaningful and ethical tribal indigenous engagement. Both of these awesome women ultimately support the co-creation of mutually beneficial conservation projects across the full range of TNC Colorado's conservation programs. Today, 30 tribal nations hold senior water rights to 20 to 25% of the water in the basin. These tribal nations bring really important leadership and unique perspectives to basin-wide strategies that address a future with less water. And as a naturalist with ACES, whose job is to lead guided nature tours to the public, I talk about the importance of water in this valley and the Colorado River every day. And yet I know shockingly little about the role that tribal nations play in the conservation and management of that water. So I'm super excited to learn from these women tonight about how tribal nations play that critical role in solving water scarcity and other environmental challenges in both the Colorado River system and beyond. So please remember, as a reminder, to hold your questions to the end. We'll have a brief Q&A after the presentation. So thank you, and please join me in welcoming Celene and Izabella.
All right, can you guys hear me okay? Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you for the introduction, and huge thank you to ACES, Wilderness Workshop, and Roaring Fork Audubon for facilitating these Naturalist Nights. I actually used to be a naturalist. It was the first job I got in Colorado, so it feels really awesome to be a part of this. Celene and I are super grateful to be here today and to see you all here in this room with us to learn more about tribal engagement in the Colorado River Basin and throughout the state of Colorado. Oh, sorry. Okay. So yeah, I want to introduce myself in my language and say Buju, Izabella, Nimiguanans, Indigenous, Makwadodam, Anishinaabe, and Da. So I just said hello. My name is Izabella. I am Bear Clan, and I'm Anishinaabe, and I am from the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe in Michigan. Pull out my Michigan map. Right in the middle is where I'm from. And it's always important for me to introduce myself in my language and then also remember where I come from. And some of the people that you'll see on this slide are my biggest inspiration and support for the work that I do, and I really wouldn't be here without them or who I am without them. So I always like to remember them and thank them and carry them with me wherever I go. So currently I am based in the Front Range of Colorado. I'm in between Boulder and Denver in an area called Broomfield. and I've been at the Nature Conservancy as the Tribal and Indigenous Engagement Program Manager for the Colorado chapter for about a year and a half now. So still kind of new, but still really honored to have done some really great work and leading a lot of really great work and being able to work with amazing people such as Celene. So it's truly an honor to be in this position. So to ground us today, I wanted to get us thinking about the land that we are on and the history that it holds. In order to do so, we'll be doing an interactive activity using the Native Lands website. This resource is Indigenous-led, and it shows Indigenous territories, treaties, and languages. I really like this resource because it is Indigenous-led, and it is a living map document that is continuously updated and based on information from Indigenous communities, Indigenous knowledge holders, and their stories. Disclaimer that this map is not a perfect resource and is suggested to do further research, and you're always going to get the best information from those communities directly. It also does not claim to recognize legal or political boundaries. So I appreciate that I see some of you already pulling out your phone. So we have a QR code on the screen, so if you want to open up your camera app, you might have to zoom in a little bit. Or you can also pull up your web browser and type in native-land.ca. So I'll give you all a moment to do that. And then there'll be a search bar at the top. You might get a disclaimer that pops up as well, so you can just exit out of that for now. And then in the search bar, you can type in Aspen, which is where we're currently located, and just take a moment to explore and interact the map. And as you're doing that, I would like for you all to think about the Indigenous people who have ancestral ties to where we are today and why this is important to be aware of. So your screen should look like this. Let's see if I can, where's this pointer? Okay, awesome. So this oval here is the Roaring Fork Valley. So as you can see, we are in the ancestral homelands of the Ute people. The Ute people were historically nomadic, and this area was summer hunting grounds for the Ute people, which had abundant resources. And also, Aspen was originally called Ute City, which some or most of you may already know, but always like to note that. So the Utes are Colorado's longest continuous residents. They do not have a migration story. They have always been in the mountains, which are very sacred to them. I also suggest checking out the Southern Ute Indian Tribe's website. They have a really great narration of their creation story as well. So why is this important to know? I think it's important for us to foster these conversations with ourselves and with each other about the lands that we inhabit, the history that it holds, and what is our place within that history, and how can we be a part of a better future moving forward. It's also important to remember that Indigenous people are still here today, and they are incredibly resilient, and it's really important not to see them as a relic of the past. And it's important to reflect on if we see these Indigenous communities here in this area today, and why not, and what are the effects of that displacement? And what is our responsibility for being on these lands that are the ancestral homelands of the Ute people? I encourage you all to carry this with you, and hopefully you'll pull up the Native Lands website when you're in other places too. It's a really great resource. Acknowledging whose land we are on is just a first step, and it's important to have these conversations, as I mentioned, and there is power to speaking truth to the land and the history, but it's really important that there's action tied to that. By not having that action, land acknowledgements have developed negative sentiments, feeling performative as if people are just checking a box and that's good enough, and it's not. When doing an acknowledgement, I think it's really important to have that self-reflection on why you're doing it, and also to take the time to research into the area and into the ancestral people that have that connection to the land. It's also important to remember that there are different ways that we can honor and acknowledge the land, and that might look different from Indigenous perspectives and non-Indigenous perspectives. And if you're hoping to do a land acknowledgement, there's some really great resources out there to guide you, and I'm always happy to share some. Celene and I are here today to talk about some of the action that TNC is doing, which is co-created based on what we were hearing from our tribal nations. So I'm going to hand it over to my incredible colleague Celene to talk more about this.
Thanks, Izabella. And I'm Celene Hawkins. I work for the Nature Conservancy's Colorado River Basin program. I'm the Tribal Partnerships Program Director, and I help with our work at the full Colorado River Basin scale. I'm a lifelong Westerner, and I've always gravitated to and lived in places where the desert meets the mountains. I grew up in Northern California, right on the edge of the Sierra Nevadas and the Great Basin, and found myself in Durango, Colorado, which is right at the edge of the San Juan Mountains and the Colorado Plateau. I spend nearly all of my free time on water in some form when I'm not working. So just really deeply love the San Juan River Basin where I live, but every time I go somewhere else in the Colorado River Basin, I think I've found my new favorite river. So apparently I just love every river that I've ever been on. And as you can see, I'm a mother, and I didn't really understand what my work meant until I knew that I was protecting this river for the next generation of people who will live in the basin. So I want to start out talking about the Nature Conservancy as an organization and how we work in partnership with Indigenous people and local communities. The Nature Conservancy is a large conservation organization. We have more than 1 million members, we have 1,000 scientists on staff, and we work in 80 countries globally. We work at nearly every scale, from projects on the ground to doing really extraordinary project and policy work that affects large areas. And we, as you see here, have a framework which you can look up online. It's publicly available about how we do our work in support of Indigenous people and local communities. When we do this work, when we are invited in, we're always supporting our Indigenous partners, their vision, their communities, and how they see conservation in the world. We're doing this in more than 24 countries globally. This is a picture of a panel that I had the pleasure of leading earlier last year with practitioners who are leading this work all over the globe. And I think about the women here and the projects that they're working on, which range from large-scale Indigenous partnerships in the Amazon River Basin to some of our colleagues who are working in Africa on work. And I'm just really inspired, and I see the future of conservation in this work. But now we'll go down to the Colorado River Basin, which is why you all came tonight, to talk about our work in partnership with tribal nations. So if you're from the Valley, I am probably not telling you anything new that the Colorado River Basin, including where we sit today, is in crisis. And there's a number of ways that I can explain it, but demand for water supply is outstripping what Mother Nature is giving us at a very large scale. You can use any of the metrics that you see on the slide. We have 40 million people who are relying on the basin. We have tremendous agricultural production. We have some of the crown jewels of the national park system. We have 30 tribal nations in the basin. And we're experiencing water stress at scale. Our forests are drying out, our rivers are drying up, and there just simply isn't enough water to serve everybody in the basin anymore. So we're at a point where people all around the basin are having really hard discussions about how we bring our use of water in this basin back into balance. And as part of that, the Nature Conservancy also emphasizes that these are not pipes and cups, these are rivers, and that if the rivers themselves are not healthy, the entire system is not going to be healthy. This affects large cities, rural and tribal communities, fish and wildlife. Everybody across this massive basin is under stress. And if that wasn't daunting enough, We have 30 tribal nations in the basin. We have not reckoned with the role of tribal water in the system. So if the math problem seemed bad, we're already using more than the basin can supply. We also have a problem that tribal nations have not fully developed in their water supplies. So this is a map of the current reservations in the Colorado River Basin. So there are significant land and water holdings throughout the basin. They're concentrated in a few areas, but tribal nations steward a lot of the lands and waters in the basin. And I was thinking about how to explain this sort of problem with the overlay of tribal water in a system that's already out of balance between demand and supply. So you heard earlier, tribal nations are rights holders to somewhere between 20 and 30% of the water in this basin. And that supply, or that number will go up as the supply shrinks and as more tribal nations quantify their water rights. But the tricky part is that tribal nations are not using all of that water today. And so I thought I would unpack an example a little bit closer to home to explain how that can happen and sort of what we're facing in the basin. So what you see on the screen is the boundaries of the Confederated Ute Reservation. These are the approximate boundaries of the 1868 treaty that designated the first reservation within the state of Colorado. And when you look at this, you might also think about the headwaters of the Colorado River Basin. The headwaters in Colorado supply about 70% of the water to the entire big Colorado River Basin that we just saw. And the 1868 boundaries of that reservation covered the vast majority, although not quite all of the western slope. So when the water rights claims were filed by the tribal nations in Colorado, they were not for the present day reservations, which you can see, I can't get the pointer to work, here, but were in fact to the entire Confederated Ute Reservation land and water base. So when tribal nations are filing claims to a base of land and water that big, the water rights claims have the potential to be quite large. And you combine that with the fact that when there was the big 20th century push to build out infrastructure and serve communities all over the West, tribal nations were often left out of that infrastructure push. So a lot of the tribal nations in the basin are early in the process of understanding what their water rights are in terms of a number and building out basic infrastructure to serve their communities, their homes, their farms, and their enterprises. So tribal nations are often pretty early in the process of growing into their water supply, and it's worth noting that when they quantify their water rights, it's the forever water supply for their members into the future. So what this means is that typically, and this has happened in every settlement or quantification that I've looked at over the West, there's a large amount of water that is legally the tribe's water to grow into, but they have not put to use yet. Now, in a system that's already struggling with a supply-demand imbalance, that means someone else is using the tribal water. So if you've heard Chairman Hart of the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe talk about the 4 U's, the unused, uncompensated, unquantified, and undeveloped water, this is what he's talking about. There's large volumes of water throughout the Colorado River Basin that are essentially propping up this system. And as tribal nations begin to develop into their supplies, the math problem that we're struggling with in the basin could get a lot worse. So what does this mean for the Colorado River Basin that is now in intense negotiations to figure out how we are going to bring water use back into balance? We're in the midst of a basin-wide negotiation about operating guidelines for this basin. And tribal nations are actually playing a really critical role in some of those processes. For the first 100 years of governance, and this was until just a few years ago, tribal nations had no formal seat in the decision-making process, and in fact, were very rarely at the table for discussions about what happens to water in the basin. That is starting to change. I've seen more historic first meetings between tribal nations, federal agencies, state governments, and local agencies in the past few years than I had ever seen for the first part of my career. We now have some formal relationships between regional entities like the Upper Colorado River Commission and tribal nations within our area. And then we are seeing some basin-wide discussions between federal agencies, states, and tribal nations. And when I think about what tribal nations are providing and offering in those spaces, I see a lot of vision and leadership. And for me, it's very apparent that the tribal leaders who are sitting in these negotiations have families who have stewarded the Colorado River Basin for thousands of years. They're bringing ideas and wisdom and vision to where we need to go at a time where the other water managers in the basin are really struggling to find a path forward. So as we sit with a crisis that is affecting so many people and often pitting people against each other and figuring out who is going to ratchet back their water use, it's often the tribal representatives that are helping us to see how we're going to find a more sustainable future. And I think that is remarkable because tribal nations, again, have really only been able to participate in any way in these discussions for the last few years, and they have a lot to lose in the discussions, and they're still showing up and leading in that way. Tribal nations are also providing a lot of leadership in the solution space. Right now, we're at a point in the Colorado River Basin that we need to be trying innovative solutions. We need to look for durable solutions that will last into the future. And we also need to find solutions that are respecting the rights of everybody in the basin. I've been really lucky to support a project on the San Juan River, which you see here, with the Jicarilla Apache Nation in the state of New Mexico that is testing all kinds of first-of-its-kind ideas. We are helping the state of New Mexico lease water from the Jicarilla Apache Nation, use a really innovative tool in the state of New Mexico called the Strategic Water Reserve to put that water back in the river when it matters most, both for water security and for endangered fish recovery. This is the kind of solution that we're going to need. We're going to need it everywhere, and in some places we're going to need it at scale. So finding these win-win-wins that provide water security and ecological benefit and also revenue to the tribal nation are going to be really important moving into the future. And it's also worth noting that while this project has extraordinary localized benefit for the state of New Mexico, it's also driving a lot of policy discussions at the higher levels because it's really the first time that we've seen a state and a tribal nation in this part of the Colorado River Basin be able to work together in this way. We have joint technical teams, we have joint teams between the tribe and the state. We're out in the field together and we're figuring out the future of this basin together. So I want to end by talking about the role of a big organization like the Nature Conservancy in this work. I often get asked, like, what is a big NGO doing in the tribal partnership space? And for me in the Colorado River Basin, the answer is pretty simple. If we're going to be deeply engaged in Colorado River matters, where tribal nations hold this many rights and we've had this many problems with inclusion and governance, we need to be working with Indigenous partners as we work with the agricultural community and cities and other partners in the basin. And I sometimes talk about this as the head and the heart, like it's just the smart thing to do. We can't find durable solutions without working with tribal nations that own this much of the land and water in the basin. But there's also the heart answer, which is it's the right thing to do. It is time for tribal nations to be at the table and helping us find that path together to a more sustainable future. People also ask me how we're doing this work. And Izabella is going to talk more about this, so I won't say a ton now, but we spent a lot of time learning and building relationships. The work really moves at the speed of trust. And I think some of the best work that I've done has been helping the Nature Conservancy build teams that can bring on really talented colleagues like Izabella to help lead our tribal partnerships work. And the other thing that I think about a lot, I had a friend tell me, please don't bake the cake before you come talk to a tribe about your work. And the more that we can walk into a room and create things together, the more we are doing together. And on the project I just talked about, I would never have walked into my friend Daryl Vihill's office and suggested a project that puts 6 billion gallons of water into the river every year. This is big. This is like an order of magnitude bigger than any other flow restoration project I've worked on. So it was really by listening to the nation's idea of what it wanted to do with its water that we got to a project that was this impactful. So I'm really excited to turn it over to Izabella to tell about some of our work in Colorado, and thank you so much for coming tonight.
Great, am I back on? Okay, awesome. All right, well, thank you so much, Celene. It's always truly inspiring and impactful to learn about all the incredible work that you do. So never get sick of it. All right, well, I'm gonna transition us and talk about the Tribal and Indigenous Engagement Program in Colorado and the importance of this work and how we built a cross-cutting initiative. I'm also going to ground us again and provide a high-level overview of tribal nations and indigenous communities in the state of Colorado. So indigenous people, which is American Indian, Native Alaskans, make up less than 2% of the state's population. And within the state, there are 2 tribal nations that have reservation lands, and that is the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe and the Southern Ute Indian Tribe, which are both located in southwest Colorado. And I can actually go back. So here you can see there's the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation, and then there's the Southern Ute Reservation. So the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation also goes into New Mexico and into Utah. And then I also want to recognize the Ute Indian Tribe, which was forced into Utah during the Meeker incident, which I highly suggest doing some more research on, and they are now based up here in Utah. And there are also about 50 tribes that have ancestral connection to the state of Colorado that have been pushed out over the past 150 years. And of those tribal nations are the Cheyenne and Arapaho people, which were removed following the Sand Creek Massacre, which was a truly devastating and awful event in Colorado's history. And if any of you are ever in the Front Range and in Denver, I highly suggest going to the History Colorado exhibit that talks about the Sand Creek Massacre and was done in complete consultation with the tribes. And they actually had opened it 10 years prior and took it down because it had painted the narrative as if it was a battle and equal on each side. So they took the work to spend 10 years working with the Cheyenne and Arapaho people to get that story right. When we talk about the speed of trust, I think that's a really great example too, because it takes time, and also the power of recognizing mistakes and how can we build forward together. And then there's the majority of indigenous people within the state also live in the Denver metro area. And the Navajo Nation and Sioux Nation are the top represented tribes in the Denver metro area. And on the screen here, we have artwork done by an indigenous artist who is Dene from the Navajo Nation, and his name is J.C. Biale. And we're really fortunate that we are able to get to work with him, and he's always happy to help me indigenize my presentations. So always have to give him a shout out and really appreciate the work that he does. So as I mentioned, I've only been in this role for about a year and a half, but I'm continuously amazed in how this work has grown throughout the entire organization and the space that it provides to continue to grow. I really believe it's important for organizations like the Nature Conservancy to support tribal and indigenous priorities, because if we're really here to support the environment. The land's original caretakers need to be at the forefront of that. And it's also important to acknowledge that the conservation mindset has not always been in alignment with Indigenous people and their ways of knowing and being. Advocating for a pristine environment that did not acknowledge or respect the deep connection that Indigenous people have had to the land since time immemorial and has kept them from the conversation on how to care for their ancestral lands. But as Celene has mentioned, we are seeing a lot of historic firsts, and we are seeing these bodies of work grow, which is really encouraging. And some Indigenous knowledge that I always carry with me is that our lands and waters are sacred, and they are seen as relatives, and we care for relatives as they care for us. And it's really important that we remember that reciprocity, and we are not separate from nature. I also really want to bring this back to Colorado and think about the Indigenous caretakers in Colorado. And this is a specific example of in the San Juan River Basin, and I can go back again to, okay, awesome, this pointer. So the San Juan River Basin in southwest Colorado right there. So more than half of the lands and waters in the San Juan River Basin are stewarded by tribal nations. And so the San Juan River Basin, the San Juan River is a tributary of the Colorado River, and there are 4 tribal nations. And I think that's really important to highlight and to remember that these tribal nations are doing such incredible work taking care of the lands and waters. And this picture here, you can see there's Celene and I, and we're also with our tribal partners and state partners working on a project that supports Indigenous-led work in the San Juan River Basin. So this is really incredible to be able to work with this team and to have leadership from both the Ute Mountain Ute and Southern Ute Indian tribe. There's also a quote that I sit with a lot and I always love to share, and it's around centering the important role that Indigenous people play in land and water management and how that in of itself is restoration. But in order for this to happen, there needs to be healing. And to have healing, there needs to be forgiveness. And for forgiveness, there needs to be a truth-telling. And that was said by Ruth Burns, who's a Chettisakoan. Because we are seeing an influx of organizations that are recognizing the importance of tribal nations and Indigenous communities, not even just being a part of these conversations, but leading this work. And it's important that organizations like the Nature Conservancy continues to do the work to be in right relations with Indigenous people and to find out how we move forward together, but to also recognize the past, which takes time and work, but I think has more durable outcomes for both people and nature. So now I'm going to share a little bit more about the Tribal and Indigenous Engagement Program and how it came to be and where we're headed. So we really built off the really great foundation that Celene, from the work that Celene led working with tribes in the water space, and created a dedicated tribal and Indigenous engagement priority in our 2020 strategic plan that emphasized the need to create cultural humility, establish meaningful and trusting relationships, as well as begin to identify tribal engagement opportunities across our entire portfolio of conservation work. It was really important that we did it at that scale. And so work on how we were going to do it at that scale, which is pretty large, we work with a really incredible tribal and Indigenous engagement consultant to help us identify and prioritize those opportunities for co-creating conservation initiatives and enhancing our capacity to engage ethically and effectively. And I also want to note, you'll hear me say a lot tribal nations and Indigenous communities, and I want to recognize that when we say tribal nations, that those are sovereign nations, and with that comes unique rights. And then we have Indigenous communities, which represents Indigenous people that aren't a part of those, that are also a part of those tribal nations, but are living here and might not have a tribal land base. And this program was built to work with both. So I was hired in October 23 to lead this newly developed program, which is such an honor, and I have to pinch myself sometimes. And I really want to thank Celene and commend her for the importance of being an ally and helping create a space for Indigenous leadership. Like, I think back to growing up, and this is such a dream job that I didn't ever know existed. To me, it was like working for the people, working for the environment. I didn't know I could do both, so I'm really, really honored to be here and to see how these positions continue to grow. And it's also an honor that we have 2 tribal members on our Colorado Board of Trustees. Their perspectives and commitment to conservation, leadership development, tradition, and the cultural perspectives they bring really ensure that we're elevating tribal priorities in our work. So from that, we have 2 core strategies that we're focused on, and that's building our internal cultural awareness and humility. You know, we really knew that we need to, if we were going to be serious about this work, we needed to take the time and do some learning. So I've had the honor of leading our staff through a tribal and Indigenous engagement learning journey that builds our staff's collective knowledge regarding Indigenous history, rights, culture, priorities within Colorado and beyond, along with the skills needed to establish those meaningful, ethical, and trusting relationships. It's been really fun. We do Indigenous film screenings, we bring in speakers, we try to do a field trip at least once a year too. So it's really been great to do that. And then we're also focusing on co-creating conservation initiatives with tribal and Indigenous partners. So we're still early in this work, and we have a lot to learn, but we've seen some incredible opportunities in a relatively short amount of time. We are particularly excited, and I'm also particularly excited about the opportunity to leverage our preserves, which are so tied to our conservation legacy, but also in a way that support our expanding vision for tribal and Indigenous engagement. And in order to strengthen our foundation for this work, we are contracting with tribally recommended firms to build our cultural resource knowledge as a companion to our natural resource expertise. So what that means is in the coming years, we'll be doing cultural resource surveys on some of our key preserves. And a cultural resource survey focuses on identifying and understanding that physical evidence of human history, which could include artifacts, home sites, and other objects or sites of importance to tribes and Indigenous people in that area. So one of those key preserves is the Zapata Ranch Preserve, which is located near Mosca in the San Luis Valley, and which is pictured here. As you can see, it's next to the Great Sand Dunes National Park. I also want to recognize that TNC does own 23 preserves in the state of Colorado, and we acknowledge that other preserves have cultural significance to Indigenous people, and we look forward to future engagement opportunities. All right, so I'm going to expand some more on this opportunity at Zapata that I'm really excited about. So the Nature Conservancy has owned the Zapata Ranch since 1999, and we bought it when we saw an opportunity to connect this preserve to a vast area of protected and connected lands. And when we acquired the preserve, there were buffalo on it, which pictured here, which is known as the Medano herd. And the herd ranges from about 1,700 to 2,000 animals, and they graze on over 40,000 acres. So I think they're pretty happy out there. And buffalo are a keystone species. Everything to how they move, graze, and release nutrients supports healthy grasslands and biodiversity. Bison are also entrenched in the cultural traditions of Indigenous people and have been for thousands of years. And you might also hear me go between bison and buffalo. I know the scientific term is bison, but we say buffalo a lot too because our tribal nations use that word a lot, and so that's what we use as well. So since 2020, the Nature Conservancy has been transferring buffalo to tribal nations through partnership with the Intertribal Buffalo Council and the Tonka Fund. Restoring buffalo it's truly incredible It restores relationships, it provides economic opportunities, regenerates the land, and strengthens food and sovereignty for tribal nations. And over the past 2 years, the Nature Conservancy has been exploring possibilities for the future of this ranch as a place to elevate and catalyze some of those strategic goals that we have, but in a way that it elevates tribal voice, choice, and action to ensure that the lands and waters can support traditional and cultural resource practices. This preserve is also a really incredible setting for bringing people from across multiple traditions to engage in buffalo restoration and explore a variety of other cultural and ecological learning opportunities. And we're increasingly learning more and more about how significant this place is to tribal and indigenous people. And this has resulted into shifting our focus of this preserve to revolve around tribal and indigenous engagement, as well as engaging with the local Latino community. We have such a tremendous opportunity here to sustain and improve ecological values, but also to elevate the priorities of tribal and indigenous peoples and communities. With this opportunity, we do recognize that significance that buffalo have to indigenous people, and we want the herd to be managed in a way that serves the tribal nations that have ancestral connection to this area. Buffalo are seen as relative to indigenous people, and I've seen firsthand how they can strengthen culture, provide healing, gathering, and learning opportunities. So we're building on our strong partnership with the Intertribal Buffalo Council. We're working together along with other indigenous organizations and tribal nations to manage this herd as a place where indigenous people can rekindle cultural connection to buffalo through transfers. So we could transfer animals to tribal nations, or through innovative learning with the Medno herd at the Medno Zapata. We are working really closely too with our buffalo restoration program at the Nature Conservancy. So we have a really incredible team, and I'm very grateful for the knowledge, skills, and heart that all partners bring to this work. You know, right now we're in the process of building relationships and developing engagement sessions and listening sessions with the tribes that have ancestral connection to the area, as well as with the local Latino community, to understand what possibilities there are with the buffalo and also beyond the buffalo at Zapata, to ensure that this is truly a co-created body of work in future. So I think it's important to wrap up with that. This all can only operate on the foundation and guidance from relationship, and as Celene mentioned, moves at the speed of trust. So it takes time, and it's, as Celene mentioned as well, it's really important to connect to your head in this space, but also to really connect with your heart. So now I'll invite Celene to come up with me and share some ways that you all can support us in this work. I would encourage you all to continue your tribal and indigenous learning journey. You know, we're all lifelong learners, and we may be in different points in this learning journey. I hope you all have learned something today, and encourage you to all carry this knowledge with you and to remember that power of truth-telling. And I have tons of resources too that I'm always happy to share. Then I'll turn it over to Celene.
Yeah, if you live in and care about the Colorado River Basin, there's no easy button and there's no top-down solution that's going to make this river basin more sustainable. So get involved, join a watershed group, put in a low-tech process-based restoration structure on your ranch if you own one. Get involved in policy discussions. It's going to be a bunch of small things adding up to really make a more sustainable basin. So I would love it if everybody in this room walked out and did one thing this year to keep the Colorado River healthy.
Mm-hmm. And also support organizations that elevate the voice, choice, and action of indigenous people in the Colorado River Basin and beyond. There's a lot of really great organizations out there that are doing really incredible work and can always use more allies and support. You know, we can't do this work alone, and It's truly been such an honor to be here with you all today and to be in community and alongside my incredible colleague, Celene. So, miigwech.